You've heard stories like this before, I'm sure. Tales of hardship and hope spun under wide open skies, where loneliness is a physical presence, as real as the dust that settles on everything. But a story is more than its shape. It is the texture of the silence between words, the weight of a glance, the warmth of a fire on a cold night. This is the story of a promise broken and another, quieter one, kept. It begins, as so many difficult things do, with the sound of a train fading into the immense, indifferent heat of the horizon, leaving behind nothing but a woman in a red dress and the shame that burned brighter than the silk. Her name was May, and she believed her life was over. She was wrong. The clatter of the train wheels on the track was a sound of finality, a metallic heartbeat fading into the vast, shimmering emptiness of the plains. May stood perfectly still on the splintered wood of the platform, her hands clenched so tightly in the folds of her red cheongsam that her knuckles were white mountains on a silk sea. The dress, a vibrant crimson embroidered with golden peonies meant for a wedding, felt like a costume for a tragic play she had not known she was cast in. It was a beacon of her humiliation. The man, Mr. Finch, had barely looked at her. He had taken one long, slow appraisal, his thin lips curling into a sneer that dissected her from the tips of her silk slippers to the carefully pinned black hair at her nape. He saw the photograph he'd been sent, a porcelain doll, serene and compliant. He saw the woman before him, smaller than he'd imagined, her eyes wide with a terror that made her seem fragile, breakable. Not the sturdy, broad-shouldered helpmate he had paid for. "You're not what was pictured," he had said, the words clipped and dry as the dead grass rustling by the tracks. He had gestured dismissively at her small lacquered trunk. "That's all you have? I need a wife, not a doll to sit on a shelf." And then he had turned, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked away without a backward glance, leaving her standing under the oppressive weight of the sun as the train that had brought her here prepared to take him away. She had watched him board, had watched the conductor wave his flag, had watched the steam billow and obscure his silhouette. Now there was only the heat, the silence, and a shame so profound it felt like a physical illness churning in her stomach. The world she knew was an ocean away. The world she had been promised had just evaporated before her eyes. The station agent, a man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, glanced at her from his office window, then quickly looked away, offering no help, no comfort. She was a piece of unclaimed baggage, an anomaly, a problem he clearly had no intention of solving. The dust, stirred by the departed train, began to settle, coating her silken slippers, the hem of her dress, and the hope she had so carefully carried across the sea. The sun bled across the sky, a spectacular wound of orange and purple that offered no comfort. It only marked the passing of time, the deepening of her predicament. The station agent finally emerged, a ring of keys jangling in his hand. He didn't speak to her, merely walked to the station house door and locked it with a decisive metallic click. He gave her one last, pitying look before disappearing down the dusty track that served as a road. The finality of that sound, the lock turning in the door, was worse than the train's whistle. It sealed her fate. She was now officially nowhere, belonging to no one. The vast, empty landscape, which had seemed so full of promise from the train window, now felt like a cage without walls. Every direction was a flat, endless expanse of brown earth and pale sky. She sank onto her trunk, the stiff silk of her dress rustling in protest. The weight of her journey, the weeks at sea, the days on the rattling train, all of it crashed down upon her. She had been so brave, she thought. She had left behind her family, her village, everything she had ever known, for the promise in a letter, for the hope of a life better than the one she was destined for. Now that bravery felt like foolishness. A tear, hot and sharp, finally escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. What was the point? Soon the darkness would come, and with it, creatures whose names she did not know, whose sounds she could not comprehend. She drew her knees to her chest, a small island of crimson in an ocean of twilight, and waited for the end. It came not as a monster from the shadows, but as the soft thud of horses' hooves and the low, inquisitive whine of a dog. A large shadow detached itself from the gloom. A man on a horse, leading another packed with supplies. Beside him trotted a German shepherd, its head cocked, its intelligent eyes fixed on her. The dog approached first, its steps tentative, its tail giving a single, cautious wag. It stopped a few feet away and whined again, a soft, questioning sound. May froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Then the man dismounted. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the brim of a worn hat. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, his presence filling the empty space around the station. He said nothing, simply stood and looked at her, his gaze taking in the impossibly bright dress, the small trunk, the single tear track on her face. Isaac Thorne did not expect to find a woman at the deserted depot, much less one who looked as if she had been plucked from a faraway storybook and dropped into the dust. He had come for the monthly delivery of salt licks and grain, a mundane chore that defined the rhythm of his solitary life. But there she was, a splash of impossible color against the monochrome twilight. His dog Buster was already making his careful acquaintance, his instincts telling him this was not a threat, but something wounded. Isaac's first thought was that she was a mirage born of heat and loneliness. His second was that she was in trouble. He walked closer, his boots sinking slightly into the deep dust. The woman flinched, pulling her arms tighter around her knees. Her eyes, dark and wide in her pale face, followed his every move. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, unused to conversation. The word meant nothing to her. She stared at him, her expression a mask of fear and exhaustion. The language barrier was a wall between them, thick and high. He pointed to himself. "Isaac," he pointed to the dog. "Buster." He then pointed down the dark track leading away from the station toward his home. "Come." The word was an invitation, but it sounded like a command. May understood. He was offering her a way out of the immediate darkness. But into what? Another man's world? Another unknown danger? She looked at his face, now more visible in the deepening gloom. It was a hard face, etched by sun and work, but his eyes held no trace of the sneering cruelty she had seen in Mr. Finch's. They were just steady and tired. Buster, as if sensing her hesitation, took a step closer and nudged her clenched hand with his wet nose. The simple, warm touch of the animal was a shock, a small point of connection in a world that had become utterly alien. It was a sign of life, of gentleness. She looked from the dog's trusting eyes to the man's patient silhouette. She had no choice. To stay was to perish. To go with him was a chance, however slim. Slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. The journey to his ranch was a silent, dreamlike procession through the deepening night. Isaac lifted her small trunk and secured it to the pack horse with practiced ease, his movements efficient and strong. He then offered her a hand up onto his own horse, placing her in front of him in the saddle. The intimacy of the proximity was terrifying. She could feel the solid wall of his chest against her back, the warmth of his body a stark contrast to the cooling night air. She kept herself rigid, every muscle tensed, ready to fight or flee, though she knew either would be useless. He seemed to sense her fear, keeping a careful distance as much as the shared space would allow, his hands holding the reins loosely, never touching her. Buster trotted alongside them, a faithful, panting shadow. The landscape was a blur of dark shapes against a sky littered with more stars than she had ever seen in her life. They were cold and distant, offering no guidance. The only sounds were the plodding of the horse's hooves, the jingle of the harness, and the man's steady breathing behind her. It was a long ride, and with every mile the faint lights of the small town behind them disappeared, plunging them into a profound and absolute darkness. This was a different kind of isolation from the one she had felt at the station. That had been an abandonment in a place meant for people. This was an immersion in a vast, wild emptiness. Finally, a single point of yellow light appeared in the distance, a lamp in a window. As they drew closer, the angular shape of a small house and the larger, darker bulk of a barn resolved out of the blackness. The home was not grand. It was a simple, functional structure of wood and stone, built to withstand the elements, not to impress. Isaac dismounted and helped her down, his hands briefly circling her waist. The touch was impersonal, practical, yet it sent a jolt through her. He led the horses to a trough, and while they drank, he walked to the house and pushed the door open, holding the lamp high. "Here," he said, the single word an offering. She stepped over the threshold into a single large room that served as kitchen, dining, and living space. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a cot was tucked into a corner. It was stark, masculine, and yet surprisingly clean. Everything had its place. There was a sense of order here, of a life lived with deliberation. He gestured toward a closed door. "That's yours." He opened it to reveal a small, spare room containing a narrow bed with a patched quilt and a small wooden crate for a table. It was little more than a cell, but it was a room with a door that closed, a space that could be hers. It was more than she'd had an hour ago. He moved about the main room with a quiet competence, lighting a fire in the hearth. The crackle of the flames and the growing warmth began to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones. May stood awkwardly in the doorway of her small room, a silent spectator in his world. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large, calloused, and capable, whether he was splitting kindling or ladling water into a pot from a bucket by the door. He didn't speak, and she was grateful for the silence. Words had become instruments of pain and rejection. The quiet of this room was a balm. Buster settled by the hearth with a contented sigh, his head on his paws, his eyes tracking his master's movements. The dog's calm presence was a steadying influence, a silent assurance that this place, this man, might be safe. Isaac took some dried meat and vegetables from a sack and added them to the pot, along with a handful of herbs from a small bundle hanging from the rafters. Soon, the simple cabin was filled with the savory smell of stew. The aroma was agonizing. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and the knot of anxiety in her stomach began to loosen, replaced by a sharp, demanding hunger. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls and placed them on the table. He set out a loaf of dark, heavy bread and 2 mugs of water. He looked at her, then nodded toward the empty chair. It was a clear invitation. She moved slowly, her silk slippers whispering on the wooden floorboards, and sat down opposite him. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the clinking of their spoons against the ceramic bowls and the crackle of the fire. She kept her eyes downcast, focused on the food, but she was intensely aware of him. She could feel his gaze on her, not leering or judgmental, but simply observant. He ate quickly and efficiently, as if refueling for more work. For May, each spoonful was a confirmation that she was still alive, that this moment was real. The stew was simple but hearty, warming her from the inside out. It was the first act of kindness she had received in this new, terrifying country. When they were finished, he took her bowl, washed both in a basin of water, and set them to dry. He checked the fire, added another log, and then turned to her. He pointed to her room again. "Rest," he said. He then took a blanket from a chest and went to the cot in the corner. He was giving her the only proper bed. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply decent, that it almost broke her. She retreated to the small room and gently closed the door. In the darkness, wrapped in the unfamiliar scent of sun-dried cotton and wood smoke, she lay on the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling, the man's soft breathing from the other room, and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. For the first time since the train had pulled away, she did not feel the sharp edge of terror. In its place was a fragile, tentative, and utterly bewildering sense of reprieve. May awoke to a world washed in pale, early morning light, filtering through the single, small window in her room. For a disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. The rough spun blanket, the hard mattress, the smell of wood smoke, it was all alien. Then the memories of the previous day rushed back. Mr. Finch's cruel dismissal, the endless hours at the desolate station, the silent man and his dog. A fresh wave of anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. What was she supposed to do now? She was a guest, a stranger, a burden. Her entire life had been predicated on fulfilling a purpose, first as a daughter, then as a prospective wife. Now she had no purpose. She crept out of the room to find the main cabin empty. Isaac's cot was neatly folded, the blanket smoothed. The fire in the hearth had been banked to glowing embers. Through the open doorway she could see the vast expanse of the land, already shimmering under the rising sun. The sheer scale of it was intimidating. Back home, the world was a tapestry of small, crowded villages and meticulously tended fields. This was a raw, untamed canvas, and she was a tiny, insignificant speck upon it. A sense of uselessness gnawed at her. She couldn't stay here forever, accepting his charity. She had to contribute, to earn her keep. It was the only way she knew to reclaim a piece of her dignity. Her gaze swept over the cabin. It was clean, but it was the cleanliness of a man living alone, functional, but lacking any touch of softness or care. The floor was swept, but dusty in the corners. The tin plates were washed, but not stacked. The windows were grimy, obscuring the morning light. An idea took root. This she could do. This was a language she knew. She found a broom by the door and began to sweep, her movements sure and practiced. She swept the dust from the corners, her small, determined figure moving back and forth across the floorboards. She found a rag and, using water from the bucket, began to clean the windows. As she scrubbed away the layers of grime, the room brightened, the sunlight pouring in, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the air. She tidied the main table, straightened the two simple chairs, and restacked the plates and mugs on their shelf, creating a small island of order. She worked with a silent, focused intensity, pouring all her fear and uncertainty into the simple, repetitive tasks. It was a meditation, a way of imposing control on a world that had spun utterly out of it. Buster, who had been sleeping on the porch, came inside and watched her, his tail giving a slow, rhythmic thump against the floor. He seemed to approve. By the time Isaac returned from his morning chores, the cabin was transformed. The air was clearer, the light brighter. The change was subtle, yet profound. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. May froze, the damp rag still in her hand, her heart pounding. She expected anger, a rebuke for touching his things, for overstepping her bounds. He looked from the gleaming window panes to the neatly swept floor, then to her, standing small and anxious in the middle of the room. He said nothing for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, carved from stone. Then he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He walked past her to the water bucket, drank deeply from the dipper, and then went back outside without a word. But the nod was enough. It was an acknowledgment, an acceptance. It was the beginning of a new, unspoken arrangement. Days bled into one another, forming a week, then two, each one governed by the rising and setting of the sun and the silent rhythm of shared labor. A routine, as unspoken and solid as the landscape around them, began to form. Isaac would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would tend to the livestock, a few dozen cattle, a handful of chickens, his 2 horses. His days spent mending fences, clearing scrub, and doing the 100 other back-breaking tasks that the ranch demanded. May, in turn, claimed the domestic sphere as her own. She rose with him, ensuring a pot of hot water was ready on the hearth. While he was out, she turned the stark cabin into a home. She found his mending basket, a neglected tangle of thread and worn-out shirts, and set to work patching the torn fabric with tiny, neat stitches that were nearly invisible. Her work was a quiet rebellion against the decay and hardship of this life. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the house, choked with weeds. With a rusty trowel she found in the barn, she began to reclaim it, her hands, once accustomed to embroidery needles, now digging in the rich, dark earth. She cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and carefully planted the few remaining seeds she found in a tin: beans, squash, and some hardy greens. Tending to the small garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could cultivate life and order in the midst of the vast wilderness. Buster was her constant shadow, lying in the shade while she worked, his presence a warm, comforting weight. He would follow her as she collected eggs from the chickens, his tail wagging in gentle encouragement, or sit at her feet in the evenings as she sewed by the firelight. Their communication was simple. She spoke to him in her native tongue, soft murmurs and gentle praises, and he would respond with a nudge of his head or a soft whine. He was the bridge between her old life and her new one, a living creature who accepted her without question or judgment. Isaac rarely spoke, but his actions formed a language she was beginning to understand. He started leaving a bucket of fresh, cool water from the well on the back porch for her every morning, saving her the effort of hauling it herself. One day, he returned from town not just with grain and salt, but with a small sack of flour and another of rice, foods he did not eat himself, but which he must have known she would prefer. He left them on the table without a word, an offering that spoke volumes. In return, she ensured a hot, savory meal was waiting for him when he came in from the fields at dusk, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She learned to cook with the ingredients at hand, making hearty stews, baking dense bread, and stretching their meager supplies with an ingenuity born of necessity. They would eat in their customary silence, but it was no longer the tense, awkward silence of strangers. It was a comfortable quiet, the silence of two people working toward a common goal: survival. It was a partnership forged not in words, but in the shared sweat and effort of their daily lives. The summer sky had been a relentless, cloudless blue for weeks, baking the earth into a cracked, thirsty canvas. Then, one afternoon, the air changed. It grew thick, heavy, and still, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on May's arms stand on end. The horizon to the west turned a bruised, greenish black. Isaac, seeing it from the far pasture, began working with a grim urgency, driving the cattle toward the relative safety of the barn. He shouted a single word as he passed the house, a word she didn't know but understood from his tone and the violent gesture he made toward the sky. "Storm!" By the time he had secured the animals, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, fat, heavy drops that splattered in the dust like dark coins. Within minutes, the deluge began. It was not like the gentle rains of her homeland. This was a furious, violent assault, a wall of water that blurred the world into a gray sheet. Wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the window panes and shrieking through the cracks in the walls. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a deafening explosion that shook the very foundations of the house, and lightning bleached the world white for a terrifying split second. May huddled by the hearth, her arms wrapped around a trembling Buster. The storm's fury mirrored the chaos she felt inside, a primal terror that stripped away the fragile sense of safety she had built. Isaac stood by the door, his face grim, watching the storm as a general watches an advancing army. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed from above, followed by the drip, drip, drip of water near the center of the room. A leak. It started as a small, steady trickle, but quickly grew into a persistent stream, pooling on the wooden floor. Isaac cursed under his breath. The water was dripping directly onto a stack of precious flour sacks. He grabbed the largest pot and shoved it under the leak, then began moving the supplies. "Help me!" he yelled over the roar of the wind. Galvanized by his urgency, May scrambled to her feet. They worked together, a frantic, synchronized team. She grabbed sacks of beans and rice while he moved the heavier bags of flour and sugar, their shoulders brushing in the tight space. The pot was already overflowing. He pointed to the roof. "I have to go up." The idea was insane. The roof was slick with rain, the wind strong enough to tear a man from his footing, but he was already pulling on a heavy oilskin coat and grabbing a hammer and a small canvas patch from a chest. Before he went out into the maelstrom, he turned to her. His eyes were intense. "Keep the fire high, and keep the buckets empty." It was the most he had ever said to her at one time. She nodded, her fear for him overriding her own. While he was gone, she worked tirelessly, bailing water from the overflowing pot into a bucket, dragging the full bucket to the door and heaving the contents out into the storm before rushing back to the ever-filling pot. It was exhausting, repetitive work, but it was a fight, and it kept the terror at bay. She was no longer a helpless victim. She was a soldier in a battle against the elements, defending their home. She didn't know how long he was on the roof. Every crack of thunder, every violent gust of wind sent a spike of fear through her. She imagined him slipping, falling into the churning mud below. The drip, drip, drip from the ceiling was a constant, maddening reminder of the battle he was fighting above her. Finally, just as she felt her arms would give out from hauling buckets of water, the dripping slowed to a trickle and then stopped. A few minutes later, the door burst open, and Isaac stumbled inside, drenched and shivering, his face pale with cold and exertion. He peeled off the dripping oilskin coat and collapsed into a chair by the fire, his body trembling. May rushed to his side. Without thinking, she grabbed the driest blanket she could find, the one from her own bed, and wrapped it around his broad shoulders. He looked up at her, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. A long, shallow cut snaked across his cheekbone, beaded with a mixture of rain and blood. She saw it, and her breath hitched. She went to the basin, dipped a clean corner of a rag in the warm water she kept by the hearth, and returned to him. She hesitated for a second. Then, gently, her touch as light as a butterfly's wing, she began to clean the wound. He flinched at the first touch, but then held perfectly still, his gaze locked on her face. In the flickering firelight, the world shrank to the small space between them. The howling of the storm outside faded into a distant roar. All she could see were his eyes, watching her with an intensity she had never seen before. All she could feel was the warmth of his skin, the rough stubble on his jaw, the surprising softness of his hair at the temple. When the cut was clean, she lowered the rag. Their eyes held for a long moment. A silent, profound understanding passed between them. In the heart of the storm, thrown together in a shared crisis, they had seen each other not as a rancher and a refugee, but as two people bound by a common struggle. He had seen her strength, her tenacity. She had seen his courage, and now his vulnerability. The barrier of language and culture that had separated them seemed to dissolve in the quiet, shared warmth of the fire. He finally broke the gaze, looking down at his hands. A low, quiet sound rumbled in his chest. "Thank you," he said. The words were rough, as if they were unfamiliar in his mouth, but they were clear. She understood. She gave a small nod, her heart beating a steady, strong rhythm, no longer in fear, but with a new, strange, and powerful emotion she could not yet name. The weeks that followed the great storm were marked by a subtle shift. The silence between them remained, but it was now laced with a different quality, not of distance, but of shared experience. The cabin, which they had saved together, felt more like a shared home than ever before. One quiet evening, as May was mending one of Isaac's work shirts by the fire, her fingers discovered a hard, rectangular object tucked deep inside a hidden inner pocket. Curious, she carefully worked it free. It was a small, tin-cased photograph, its edges worn smooth with time and handling. She opened it. The image was faded, a sepia-toned ghost of a woman with a kind smile and light-colored hair swept up in a simple style. She was standing in front of this very cabin, though the wood was newer then, and a climbing rose bush, now long dead, bloomed by the door. The woman's arm was linked through that of a much younger Isaac. He looked different, smoother, less weathered, a hint of a smile on his own face. It was a portrait of a life that had existed before her, a life she knew nothing about. She felt a pang of something she couldn't identify, not jealousy, but a profound sense of trespassing, of stepping into a story that had begun long before her arrival. She was just about to slip the photograph back into the pocket when the cabin door opened. Isaac came in, stamping the dust from his boots. He stopped when he saw what she was holding. A shadow passed over his face, a flicker of pain so deep and raw it made her want to look away. She expected him to be angry, to snatch the photograph from her. She quickly held it out to him, a silent apology in her eyes. But he didn't take it. He walked slowly to the hearth and sank into his chair, his gaze fixed on the image in her hands. He stared at it for a long time, the firelight playing over the hard lines of his face. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. May held her breath. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and rough. "Mary." The name hung in the air between them, a single, heavy word that contained a world of love and loss. He reached out, not to take the photo, but to trace the image of the woman's face with a calloused finger. "My wife," he added, his voice barely a whisper. "Fever. Took her 4 years ago. Winter." The clipped, sparse sentences conveyed more than a long speech ever could. They spoke of a grief so profound it had been sealed away, a loneliness that had hollowed him out from the inside. He had built walls around his heart just as he had built fences around his land. In that moment, May understood him completely. His silence wasn't coldness, it was a shield. His solitude wasn't a preference, it was a scar. She looked from the ghost in the photograph to the living, breathing man before her, and her heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming empathy. He was as lost and alone as she was. She gently closed the tin case and, instead of putting it back in the shirt, she walked over to the mantelpiece above the fire. She stood the small photograph up, leaning it against a stone, giving it a place of honor in the home they now shared. It was a small gesture, but it was an acknowledgment of his past, an acceptance of the ghost that lived there with them. Isaac watched her, and for the first time she saw the harsh lines around his eyes soften with something other than exhaustion. He saw that she was not trying to erase his past, but to make space for it. Summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The leaves on the lone cottonwood tree by the creek turned a brilliant yellow, and the rhythm of their lives shifted with the season. They worked together to prepare for the coming winter, harvesting the last of the vegetables from May's garden, canning and preserving them in jars that now lined the shelves of the cabin. They chopped and stacked firewood until a formidable wall of it stood against the side of the house. The work was hard, but satisfying. It was the work of building a future, of ensuring survival. The unspoken question of May's own future, however, remained. She was no longer a temporary guest, a refugee. She was a part of this place. But what part? She was not his wife, not his servant, not his family. She existed in a space between definitions, a fragile arrangement that could be broken as easily as it was formed. One evening, after a particularly long day of work, they sat by the fire. The meal was finished, the dishes were clean. Buster was asleep at their feet, his paws twitching as he dreamed. The silence in the cabin was deep and comfortable, but tonight it felt charged with a new weight. Isaac stared into the flames, turning a small piece of wood over and over in his hands. He seemed to be wrestling with something, searching for words that did not come easily to him. May watched him, her hands still in her lap, a familiar sense of anxiety fluttering in her chest. Finally, he stopped fidgeting with the wood and looked at her. His gaze was direct, steady, and achingly earnest. "May," he began, and the sound of her name in his rough voice was still a small shock. He rarely used it. "Winter is coming. It's hard. Here. Lonely." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This ranch, it's too much for one person. I know that now. I thought I could do it. After Mary, I thought being alone was what I needed. I was wrong." He looked down at his calloused hands, then back up at her. "You have made this a home again. You work harder than anyone I've ever known. You're strong. You're good." The simple, unadorned praise was more powerful than any flowery poetry. It landed in her heart with a solid, reassuring weight. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for who she was. "This isn't a fair life for you," he continued, his voice low. "You deserve more than this. A real town, other people, a proper life." He took a deep breath, the sound of it filling the quiet room. "But I find myself hoping that this is the life you might want." He leaned forward slightly, his expression stripped of all its usual stoicism, leaving only a raw, hopeful vulnerability. "I need a partner, May. Not just for the winter, for all the seasons to come." He did not speak of love or passion. The words he used were practical, grounded in the earth and the seasons that governed their lives. Partner, home, future. Yet for May, they were the most romantic words she had ever heard. Love, as she had been taught to understand it, was about duty and arrangement. Passion was a dangerous, fleeting thing. But partnership, that was about strength, respect, and the shared, steady effort of building a life together, side by side. It was about facing the storm, stacking the wood, and sharing the quiet warmth of the fire at the end of a long day. It was everything she had found here in this unlikely place with this unlikely man. He reached into his pocket and pulled out not a ring, but a folded piece of paper. He carefully unfolded it and laid it on the small table between them. It was a legal document, a deed to the property. He had been to town. At the bottom, next to his own bold, stark signature, was a new line where the county clerk had carefully written her name, May Thorne. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw the depth of his offer. He wasn't just offering her protection or a roof over her head. He was offering her a stake, a share, a tangible piece of this land. He was making her his equal. He was giving her a name, a place to belong. "I am asking you to be my wife," he said, his voice steady and clear. "To build this life with me, if you'll have me." She looked from the paper to his face, the face that had become the anchor of her world. She saw the anxieties and the hopes warring in his expression. She thought of Mr. Finch's sneer, of the station agent's indifference, of the crushing loneliness of that first night. And then she thought of Isaac's quiet decency, the way he left water for her, the way he bought her rice, the way he had stood on the roof in a raging storm to protect their home. She thought of Buster, who rested his head on her knee, a constant, furry reassurance. This man had not bought her. He had rescued her, and in the months since he had come to respect her. Now he was asking her to choose him, to choose this life, freely. A single happy tear traced the same path as the first, lonely one had at the train station. But this tear was not born of sorrow. It was born of a profound, overwhelming gratitude. She looked at him, a real, radiant smile spreading across her face for the first time since she'd arrived in this country. She didn't need words. Her smile was answer enough. But she gave him the word anyway, her voice soft but certain. Yes. He let out a long breath he seemed to have been holding for an eternity, and the relief that washed over his face was a beautiful thing to see. He reached across the table and took her hand, his large, rough palm enveloping hers. It wasn't a lover's caress, not yet. It was a handshake, a promise, the sealing of a partnership. Outside, the autumn wind whispered around the corners of the small cabin, but inside, by the warmth of the fire, two solitary souls had finally and truly found their home.